For most people, God is simple. One perfect God, creator of everything, all-powerful, all-knowing. That's the version most of us grew up with. But here's the problem. Every culture that has ever existed has tried to answer two questions. Where did everything come from? And why is this world broken? That idea, the singular, perfect, all-powerful creator God, answers only one, not both, and is not universal. Some traditions took that idea and pushed it further, much further. They asked, what if the God who created this world is not the real source behind everything? By the 3rd century CE, entire movements were built on exactly this idea. The source of being, the monad, is not the creator God. So how did anyone get there? The trail begins somewhere you might not expect. Not in Alexandria, not in Greece, not with any theologian. It begins with a simple, human problem. And before we trace how this idea developed, let's briefly establish what it's about. Everything that follows will make more sense. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, a network of communities spread across the Roman Empire, in Alexandria, Rome, Syria, and beyond, who called themselves by various names, but are known to history as Gnostics. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. These communities believed salvation was not about what you believed or how you behaved. It was about what you knew. Specifically, the knowledge of where you really came from and how to get back. Their map of reality looked like this. At the very top, an unknowable, ultimate source of all being they called the monad. So perfect, so pure, so far beyond the material world that it cannot even be called God. It cannot create, it cannot speak, it simply is. Below it, a lesser divine being, flawed, ignorant, perhaps even arrogant, who actually built the world we live in, and trapped inside every human being, a spark of the monad's original divine light, lost in the material world, yearning to find its way home. But was this idea uniquely Gnostic? Tonight, that's our destination. Now let's trace how anyone got to this idea, because nobody woke up one morning and invented this. It took 1,500 years, and it starts in the age of supreme gods, where the world runs on divine power. Imagine you're living somewhere on the Iranian plateau, around 1200 BCE. You are a farmer, a herder, or a soldier. Your world is shaped by forces you cannot control: drought, disease, invasion, death. You need to understand why bad things happen. You need to know which side to be on. Then a teacher arrives, a prophet. His name is Zarathustra, or Zoroaster in the Hellenized, Greek version. And he tells you something that feels immediately, viscerally true. The universe is at war. On one side, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the source of light, truth, and order. On the other, Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the source of chaos, lies, and death. Every sunrise is a battle. Every harvest, every drought, every act of kindness or cruelty, all of it part of the same cosmic struggle. And humans are central to this battle. Your job is to choose a side between good and evil, and to fight. This is Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest organized religions, originating in ancient Persia, modern-day Iran. At its heart, Zoroastrianism is defined by a dualistic cosmology, an eternal struggle between the forces of good and evil. Nietzsche viewed the historical prophet as the first to create the error of morality. Scholar Mary Boyce, who spent decades studying Zoroastrian communities in Iran, called it the most significant development in the history of religious thought before the Abrahamic traditions. It was the official religion of major Persian empires, Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian, for over a millennium, and it significantly influenced the development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, Ahura Mazda, the benevolent creator, is indeed powerful, but he engages in the fight. He cares about the outcome. He is supreme in the way a king is supreme, by power, authority, and will. But he is not beyond the universe. He's just the best thing in it. That distinction matters enormously, so plant it in your mind and hold it. Now let's travel west, to Egypt. The year is 1353 BCE. A pharaoh named Amenhotep IV is about to do something that will shake his entire civilization. The current religious establishment is composed of a vast network of temples dedicated to dozens of gods. Not one, dozens. Presiding over it is a powerful priestly class that has been accumulating land and wealth for centuries. But Amenhotep IV has other plans. He tears it all down and declares that there is only one God worth worshipping, the Aten, the sun disk, the physical light of the sun itself. He renamed himself Akhenaten, effective for Aten. He built a dedicated capital city from scratch, Akhetaten, horizon of Aten, known today as Amarna, to serve as the religion's spiritual center. Then, he commanded his entire civilization to redirect its devotion toward this single supreme deity. The shift? It replaced the traditional Egyptian pantheon and the powerful priesthood of Amun, with a system where the pharaoh was the sole intermediary between the people and the god. For 17 years, he enforces the most radical monotheism the ancient world has yet seen. In fact, Atenism is often considered the first documented form of monotheism or monolatry in history. The Egyptologist Jan Assmann argued in his 1997 work, Moses the Egyptian, that Akhenaten introduced something genuinely new. The idea that devotion to one god requires the rejection of all others, not just preference, active exclusion. That's significant. After Akhenaten's death, his successors, including Tutankhamun, dismantled everything he had built and restored traditional polytheism. His city was abandoned. His name was chiseled off monuments. The old priests came back. The old gods returned. The revolution died with him, but something about it is worth sitting with for a moment. Akhenaten's movement, no matter how revolutionary, failed politically. It was erased from Egyptian memory so thoroughly that for thousands of years historians barely knew it had happened, and it did not solve the question we started with. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, why is this world broken? The Egyptians suppressed the question. Akhenaten barely even framed it, but it kept surfacing in Jewish theology, in Greek philosophy, eventually in Christianity and Islam. Now move northeast, to the hill country of Canaan, and to a deity whose story is far more complex than we're led to believe. His name is Yahweh. And here's something worth considering. The earliest Israelites were not monotheists, not in the sense we usually mean. Scholar Mark Smith documented this extensively in his 2001 work, The Origins of Biblical Monotheism. The oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible preserve traces of a religious world where multiple divine beings existed, and where Yahweh was the highest, but not the only. Psalm 82 opens with God standing in a divine council, a gathering of gods, over which Yahweh presides as judge. Deuteronomy 32, in its oldest textual form, describes the nations of the earth being divided among the sons of God, with Israel as Yahweh's personal portion. This makes him a local deity, not universal. Yet, scholars call this phase monolatry, which sounds technical, so let's make it simple. Think of it like a football fan. You support your team passionately. You know other teams exist, but you just don't care about them. And if they compete against yours, you want them to lose. Early Israelites worshipped Yahweh the same way, not because other gods didn't exist, but because Yahweh was theirs. He had chosen them. They had chosen him. That was the deal. Monolatry, loyalty to one god among many. This was about to change, dramatically, around the 8th century BCE. We'll come back to it later. Now notice what's still missing in all three traditions: Zoroastrianism, Atenism, early Yahwism. They propose supreme creation power, supreme universality, but not a supreme source behind existence itself. That step requires a different kind of mind entirely. And that's where we go next. Picture the Greek colony of Croton in southern Italy, around 530 BCE. A strange community has formed here. From the outside, it looks like a philosophical school. From the inside, it is something stranger, part school, part brotherhood, part religious order. Its members follow strict rules: no eating beans, no touching white roosters, believe in reincarnation, wake before dawn to greet the rising sun in silence. At the center of this community is a teacher whose name you know, but whose actual life is almost impossible to recover. Why? Because he left no writings. Everything attributed to him was written centuries after his death by his followers. His name was Pythagoras. And the question he planted in Western thought about what lies at the absolute foundation of reality is about to change everything. The Pythagorean insight was this: the deepest structure of reality is not made of stuff. It's made of relationships, of number, of pattern. Think about music for a moment. A musical note doesn't feel like math. It feels like beauty, emotion, sensation, the thing that makes you stop what you're doing, that moves something in your chest you can't quite name. And yet the relationship between notes, the intervals that make a chord harmonious or dissonant, can be expressed as precise numerical ratios. Pluck a string. Now pluck a string exactly half as long. You get a note exactly 1 octave higher. The ratio 2:1. Every culture that has ever made music has discovered this independently, because it is not a cultural preference, it is a fact about reality. The Pythagoreans discovered this, and it electrified them. If the harmony of sound is built on number, what else is? What if the entire universe, at its deepest level, is mathematical structure all the way down? What if the orbits of the planets, the growth of plants, the proportions of the human body, what if all of it is number in disguise? And if that's true, then the ultimate question becomes, what is the source of number? Their answer: the monad. Now here's where we need to slow down, because this is the concept at the heart of this entire video. In ordinary language, monad just means unit, one single thing. But in Pythagorean philosophy, the monad is something far stranger and more fundamental. It is not the number 1 in the way one apple or one house is one. It is the principle of oneness itself, the pure, undivided unity that makes counting possible in the first place. Here's a simpler way to understand what that means. Imagine the number 1, not one of anything, just one. The concept, the pure idea of being undivided, complete in itself, and the source from which every other number flows. Before you can count to 2, you need to have grasped what 1 is. Before you can understand division or multiplicity, you need unity. The monad is the ground beneath number, the principle that makes number possible, prior to any particular numbered thing. That is the monad, not a thing, the principle behind things, the source of all multiplicity, perfect in its unity, beyond description, beyond any quality you could name, because the moment you name a quality, you've introduced a distinction, and distinction is the first step away from perfect unity. The Pythagorean monad is not a god you pray to. It is not a being with intentions or a will. It is the deepest structural feature of reality, the ground beneath the ground. And here's why this matters for our story. Before the Pythagoreans, divine transcendence meant power. A god was supreme because he was stronger, more enduring, more capable than everything else. Ahura Mazda was supreme by force. Yahweh was supreme by authority and covenant relationship. After the Pythagoreans, divine transcendence can mean something completely different. Something can be supreme not because of power, but because of purity, because of its freedom from division, from change, from the complexity of ordinary existence. The monad is highest, not because it dominates everything below it, but because everything below it depends on it. In a way, it does not depend on them. Now the divine has begun to abstract, and it doesn't stop here. Let's move forward roughly 2 centuries, to Athens, to a man named Plato. Plato doesn't use the word monad in his most famous works, but he builds the same architecture. In Plato's philosophy, the form of the good is the ultimate metaphysical principle, described in the Republic as the greatest thing to learn about. It sits at the absolute pinnacle of the hierarchy of forms, acting as the source from which all other forms, like justice, beauty, and truth, derive their value and existence. Just as the sun is the source of light and life in the physical world, the form of the good provides the light of truth that makes the forms intelligible to the mind's eye. But here's the thing that stops most people cold when they really sit with it. Plato says the form of the good is beyond being, not the highest being, not the most powerful being, beyond being itself. Let that land for a moment. He is describing something so fundamental that even existence, the simple fact of being something rather than nothing, comes from it rather than applies to it. Confused? Picture an ocean. Everything that exists is a wave, rising, breaking, returning. The ocean is the source of every wave, but the ocean itself is not a wave. It is something else entirely. That is the closest example of what Plato is pointing at. This is no longer the language of kings and warriors. This is something else entirely. And then, in the Timaeus, Plato introduces a figure called the Demiurge, a craftsman god who fashions the material world by looking upward at perfect eternal forms and trying to replicate them in matter. Notice what Plato has done here. He has separated the highest reality, perfect, abstract, beyond being, from the craftsman, the being who actually does the work of making the world. The highest source and the maker of the world are not the same thing. This is not the Gnostic Demiurge yet. Plato's craftsman is noble and good, not corrupt or ignorant. But the conceptual template is in place. The gap between ultimate reality and the act of creation has opened. Now the question that haunts every philosopher who follows Plato: if ultimate reality is perfect, unified, beyond all division, how does the imperfect, divided, messy material world come from it? This is called the problem of emanation, and it becomes one of the great obsessions of ancient philosophy. By the 2nd century CE, a Syrian philosopher named Numenius of Apamea is trying to answer it. He famously asks, "What is Plato but Moses speaking Greek?" Genuinely believing that the Jewish and Greek traditions are pointing at the same ultimate reality from different directions. So he describes 3 levels of divinity: the first God, perfectly at rest and transcendent; the second, who creates by gazing at the first; and the third, which is the world itself. 3 layers. Here, the divine is becoming a hierarchy, not a single figure. And now, for the first time, you can start to see where this is heading. But Greek philosophy, on its own, will never quite get there, because the monad as a mathematical principle is cold, abstract, impersonal. It still doesn't answer the question of why the world is full of suffering. It doesn't explain why a perfect source would originate something this broken. For these ideas to become a burning theological revolution, for them to generate movements of people who reorganize their entire lives around this vision, they need to collide with something warmer, something that has been asking, desperately and personally, how a good God can allow pain and suffering. They need to meet the God of the Hebrew Bible. Now let's step back to the 8th century BCE, back to the early Yahwism and the most important theological crisis in Jewish history. When the Assyrian Empire destroys the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, hundreds of thousands are deported. The southern kingdom of Judah watches in horror, wondering if they are next. And then in 586 BCE, what they feared most happens. Babylon destroys Jerusalem. The temple burns. A group of Jewish priests, scribes, and nobles are sitting in exile, hundreds of miles from home, far from Jerusalem, far from the temple that defined everything they understood about their God. They have homes, communities, daily life, but they are shattered because the temple is gone. And the temple was not just a building. In ancient Israelite theology, the temple in Jerusalem was the place where God literally dwelled. The Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber, was his throne room. The priesthood was the channel through which divine presence flowed into the world. Nebuchadnezzar hasn't just defeated Israel militarily, he has destroyed the house of God. 2 catastrophes in 2 centuries. Both force the same question that will quietly change everything. If Yahweh is Israel's God who lives in the temple, and the temple is ash, where is Yahweh now? Did Babylon's gods defeat him? Was he never as powerful as they thought? The prophets of this era, Isaiah, Micah, Amos, Jeremiah, reject every one of those answers, and what they replace them with changes everything. Yahweh is not gone. He permitted this, they argue, not because he was defeated, but because Israel broke the covenant. Yahweh is not just Israel's God, he is the God of all nations. The Assyrians are his instrument of punishment, Babylon is his tool, Egypt is his chess piece. If that's true, if Yahweh controls all nations, then he must be above all gods. And if he's above all gods, then maybe the other gods aren't really gods at all. Deutero-Isaiah, the anonymous prophet writing from inside the exile, whose words appear in Isaiah chapters 40 through 55, makes this claim with a directness that had no precedent in Hebrew scripture. Before me no god was formed, nor shall there be any after me. Other gods are nothing, idols are wood and metal. Yahweh alone created the heavens and the earth. This is no longer monolatry. This is monotheism, full, uncompromising, exclusive. Now something subtle but enormous starts to shift. The local God who once walked in gardens, wrestled with Jacob, appeared to Moses in fire and smoke, begins to recede. Post-exilic texts increasingly emphasize how far God is from the material world, how unapproachable, how beyond human categories. His thoughts are not human thoughts. His ways are not human ways. The gap between creator and creation widens. At the same time, Jewish wisdom literature begins personifying divine wisdom, Chokmah in Hebrew, as a kind of separate figure present at creation. In Proverbs 8, wisdom speaks in the first person. I was there when he set the heavens in place. I was the craftsman at his side. She is not a separate God, but she is not quite identical with God either. She occupies a space between the transcendent creator and the act of creation. That space is small, almost imperceptible, but it's there. And here's something worth noticing. The rabbis who compiled the Jewish scriptures were clearly aware of this tension. They preserved both kinds of texts, the ones where God walks in gardens and wrestles with Jacob, and the ones where he is utterly beyond human comprehension, without resolving the contradiction. Both sit in the same canon. The personal God and the transcendent God, side by side. That unresolved tension is doing something. It is building pressure, quietly, over centuries. And the apocalyptic texts of this same period are now filling the sky with angels. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, entire hierarchies of heavenly beings who carry God's will into the world, precisely because God himself is becoming too holy for direct contact with matter. In the book of 1st Enoch, a Jewish text compiled between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE during the Second Temple period, the heavens are layered. Multiple levels of divine reality stacked above the earth, each populated by more powerful beings than the one below. God sits at the top, increasingly remote. So what is happening? Jewish theology is doing something the Greek philosophers are doing simultaneously, from a completely different direction. It is pushing God upward, away from the world, away from the tribal, personal, wrestling in the dark God of the earliest stories, more universal, more transcendent, and crucially, it is doing this not because of philosophical speculation, but because of lived catastrophe, the Babylonian exile, the Assyrian destruction, the grinding pressure of being a small people under the thumb of one empire after another. The question of divine transcendence is not abstract for these communities. It is the most urgent question they have. If God is truly universal, truly sovereign, truly the sole creator of all things, then why does his world look like this? A local tribal God can have a bad day, but an all-knowing, all-powerful, utterly transcendent God who created everything from nothing, How does that God produce a corrupted world? That question, the one we've been asking since the beginning, is going to haunt every thinker we encounter from here on. And the Gnostics are going to give it the most radical answer anyone has ever proposed. But before we get there, one man tries to hold the tension together. One man who reads both the Torah and Plato and builds a bridge between them that almost holds. Imagine standing in Alexandria around 20 BCE. This is the greatest intellectual city in the ancient world. Its famous library, the most ambitious attempt in human history to gather all human knowledge in one place, has been drawing scholars from across the Mediterranean for generations. Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars, Babylonian astronomers, all of them rubbing against each other in the markets, the academies, the synagogues. The tension between these traditions is creative, and this is where Greek philosophy meets the God of the Hebrew Bible. In a wealthy Jewish household near the center of this city, a man is sitting with two books open in front of him. One is the Torah, the other is Plato. His name is Philo of Alexandria. Born around 20 BCE into one of the most prominent Jewish families in Egypt, his brother Alexander administered customs for the entire Eastern Empire, making him one of the wealthiest men in the Roman world. He read Plato, the Stoics, the Pythagoreans with genuine depth and fluency, and he remained deeply, committedly Jewish. He believed these two traditions were pointing at the same truth from different directions, and he set out to prove it. Philo's God is unlike anything in earlier Jewish writing. He writes across multiple works that God is so far beyond human understanding that even the word God falls short. God is not a being among beings. He is the source of being itself. He has no qualities you can name, not good, not wise, not just, because every quality you apply creates a category that contains him, and nothing can contain him. Think of it this way. If someone asks you to describe silence, truly complete silence, the moment you say it's peaceful or it's empty, you've already moved away from it. You've introduced a quality. True silence is beyond all description. That's how Philo describes God. Beyond name, beyond quality, beyond being itself. Philosophers call this the theology of negation. You can only say what God is not, because every positive description limits him. Philo applies it to the God of the Hebrew Bible, and immediately he faces a problem. If God is utterly beyond the world, too pure, too transcendent, too absolutely other, then how did he create it? The God of Genesis speaks, and the world appears. He forms Adam from dust. He plants a garden. He walks through it in the evening. He wrestles with Jacob. He appears to Moses. This is a God who touches the world. How does Philo reconcile a God too transcendent to be described with a God who gets his hands dirty in creation? His answer is the Logos. The Logos, meaning word or reason in Greek, is Philo's bridge between the transcendent God and the material world. Think of it as God's outward face, his self-expression turned toward creation, the aspect of divine reality that engages with matter while the innermost divine nature stays untouched. God does not touch matter directly. The Logos does. This is not a new God, not a rival to Yahweh. More like, if ultimate divinity is a king too holy to leave the throne room, the Logos is the royal ambassador who actually governs the kingdom in his name. He carries the king's authority. He speaks in the king's voice, but he is not the king. The king remains, untouched, in a room no one else enters. Philo draws a line. Above it, the transcendent God, beyond all description. Below it, the Logos, the intermediary, and through it, the world. That line is thin. The distance is real but not adversarial. Creation is good. Matter is not evil. The Logos is noble, divine, ordered. Philo is careful. He holds the tension. But, similar to Plato, he has introduced conceptual space between the highest divine reality and the act of creation. And this is the moment that will echo through everything that follows. Once that space exists, it has a logic of its own. If God requires an intermediary to engage with the world, is that intermediary equal to God? Most would say no. If it is lesser than God, how much lesser? Does that explain why it created an imperfect world? Not accidentally, consequentially. Philo does not ask those questions. He's too careful, too rooted in the goodness of creation as Genesis describes it, too committed to the Jewish covenant tradition that insists God and the world are in relationship, not opposition. But the questions are now possible, and within a generation, communities across the Roman world are going to ask them, loudly, systematically, and with answers that will disturb the Church for centuries. Before we get there, we need to look at the communities that stood between Philo and the Gnostics, because not everyone who felt this pressure moved in the same direction. Some pulled back, some pushed forward. And the difference between those two choices is where our story gets truly strange. Here's something the popular version of this story almost always skips. The path from Philo's careful synthesis to the Gnostic explosion was not inevitable. Not everyone who felt the pressure of divine transcendence followed it to the same conclusion. Running parallel to the Hellenizing current, the current flowing from Philo toward increasingly abstract divine hierarchies, was a powerful countercurrent. Communities that felt the same theological tension and moved in precisely the opposite direction. Imagine a small Jewish Christian community somewhere in the Transjordan region, around 100 CE. They follow Jesus. They believe he was the Messiah, but they have rejected everything Paul taught about Gentiles and Torah. They observe Jewish law completely, circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath, festivals. They do not believe Jesus was divine in any pre-existent cosmic sense. He was a human being, a prophet, a man chosen by God at his baptism. These are the Ebionites, and their theology is a direct, conscious resistance to the drift we have been tracing. For the Ebionites, God is Yahweh, the Creator, the covenant partner, directly engaged with the world he made. There is no gap between the highest source and the Creator. There is no hidden source above Yahweh. There is no Logos intermediary. God made the world, and it is good, and the law he gave Israel is how you live in it faithfully. They are, in a sense, holding the line that Philo nearly crossed. Now consider another community, also Jewish Christian, also from around 100 CE, the Elcesaites. Our main sources for them are hostile, Hippolytus of Rome and Epiphanius, both of whom considered them heretical, so we handle their descriptions carefully. What we can say is this: the Elcesaites practiced repeated water immersions for purification, observed Jewish law, and rejected Paul. So far, similar to the Ebionites. But their cosmology was different. Elcesaite texts describe a layered heavenly structure, vast divine figures, heavenly dimensions, cosmic architecture stacked above the earth. This is not Greek philosophical abstraction. It feels more like the elaborate heavenly visions of Jewish apocalyptic literature, First Enoch, the Qumran texts, where the heavens are layered and divine beings inhabit each level. So here's what these two communities reveal. The same theological pressure, how does a transcendent God relate to a broken world, is producing two completely different responses. One pulls back towards strict Jewish monotheism. One begins elaborating a cosmic hierarchy. The Gnostics take that second tendency and push it to its absolute limit. But what makes the Gnostic answer unique, what makes it genuinely radical rather than just cosmologically elaborate, is not the hierarchy itself. It's what they say about the being at the bottom of that hierarchy, the one who made our world. Sometime in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, texts begin circulating across the Roman world that describe reality in a way no previous tradition had quite dared. Pick up one of the most important of these texts, the Apocryphon of John, a Gnostic document discovered among the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945. Its opening is unlike anything in Jewish or Greek philosophy before it, and it describes the monad. It is pure light into which no eye can gaze. It is the invisible spirit. One should not think of it as a god or as being like a god. It is greater than a god. It has no dominion above it. It does not exist in something inferior to it. Everything exists in it. Read that carefully. Greater than a god, not the highest god, not the most powerful god, something for which the category of God is itself inadequate. Now hold that image and compare it to everything we have traced so far. Ahura Mazda was the highest being in the universe, but he was present, fighting a battle, engaged with outcomes. He was supreme by power. Yahweh, after the exile, was the sole creator of all things, universal, transcendent, beyond tribal limits, but still the creator, still directly involved in history, still present. Philo's God was beyond description, too pure for direct contact with matter, so he expressed himself through the Logos, and the Logos was noble, ordered, and good. The Gnostic Monad is none of these things. It does not create, it does not decide, it does not act, it simply is, perfect, silent, immovable, complete. So, if it does not create, how does the world come from it then? Not by decision, not by will. The monad's perfection overflows, the way a full cup spills without deciding to, the way a candle gives light without choosing to. Divine qualities flow outward from the monad in a cascading series of emanations, each one slightly less perfect than the one above. Think of a copy machine. You take an original document, crisp, sharp, perfect, and you make a copy. Then you take that copy and make another copy, then another, and another. Each generation gets a little more blurred, a little less defined. The further you get from the original, the more something is lost. Just like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped in still water, each ring slightly fainter than the last. That's emanation. These emanations are called aeons, divine qualities given a kind of personal existence. Truth, life, mind, logos. They form together what the Valentinian tradition calls the Pleroma, the divine fullness, the complete spiritual universe existing above and beyond the material world. Now, in the Valentinian system, developed by Valentinus, who taught in Rome around 136 to 165 CE, something goes wrong inside this perfect divine world. The lowest of the aeons is named Sophia, wisdom. She tries to grasp the unknowable source through her own act of will, without the proper mediation that the Pleroma's structure requires. It is an act of overreach, isolated, without a proper partner, that generates something that should not exist. A malformed, chaotic emanation, born without structure, without order, without the balance that the rest of the Pleroma maintains. It is cast out, expelled from the Pleroma into the void below. And from this chaotic emanation, stranded in the formless darkness beyond the Pleroma, something stirs. A being arises. It looks around at the darkness and emptiness surrounding it. It has no knowledge of the Pleroma above, no awareness that it came from somewhere else. It exists, alone, in the void, and it decides to create. It fashions a material world, shaping matter, imposing order of a kind on the chaos around it. It forms the heavens and the earth. It makes human beings, and into those human beings, it unknowingly places the trapped sparks of divine light that came with Sophia's chaotic emanation. When it is finished, it looks at what it has made and declares, "I am God, there is no other." This is the Demiurge. Think of it as a foreman who believes he's the owner. He runs the construction site. He gives orders. He is genuinely convinced the building is his, that no authority exists above him. He has never met the actual owner. He doesn't know there is one. That's the Demiurge. Not necessarily evil in the way Angra Mainyu was evil. Not a deliberate adversary of good. Something more unsettling. A creator who is unaware of his own nature. Whose arrogant confidence in his own authority is the problem. Who mistakes his own voice for the voice of ultimate reality. For many Gnostic communities, the Demiurge maps directly onto the God of the Hebrew Bible. And here is where the Gnostic answer to the oldest human question comes into full focus. Why is the world broken? Not because of human sin, not because of evil forces opposing a good creator, not because of a mystery too deep for human understanding, because the God who made it did not know what he was doing. He was a flawed lesser being, working with fallen material, without access to the perfect pattern of the monad above him, producing a corrupted world that reflects his own limitations rather than any ultimate perfection. The sparks of divine monad light trapped in human beings, fragments of Sophia's original emanation, are the proof. They feel the wrongness of this world because they carry a memory, however dim and buried, of something better, something truer, something that exists above the Demiurge and his flawed creation entirely. And gnosis, knowledge of this reality, is what liberates them. Not faith, not law, not prayer to the Demiurge. Knowledge of where you actually came from, knowledge of what you actually are, knowledge of how to find your way back home to the source. Picture what that means for the person sitting in a Gnostic community in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE. You live in an empire built on conquest, on slavery, on the casual brutality of power. You watch good people suffer and corrupt people prosper. You have been told your whole life, by the official religion, by the philosophers, by the authorities, that this world is good, that the God who made it is good, that suffering has a purpose, that justice will come. And some part of you has never quite believed it. Now someone hands you a text, the Apocryphon of John, or the Gospel of Truth, or any of the dozens of Gnostic documents circulating through communities across the empire, and it tells you something different. This world is broken not because of your sin, not because of mystery too deep to understand, but because the being who made it is not the ultimate source of reality. He is limited and flawed. Above him, far above him, in a realm of light and fullness he cannot even perceive, the true source exists in perfect silence, and a fragment of that divine light is inside you. That is what you are, not a creature of the Demiurge, a spark of the monad, trapped in a material body, waiting to be remembered. That is gnosis in Gnostic perspective, the knowledge of reality and your divine nature that sets you free. Can you see why this idea spread? Now look at the road that led here. Zoroastrianism gave us a supreme God engaged in cosmic battle, but still inside the world, not beyond it. Greek philosophy gave us the monad as first principle, ultimate unity, beyond description, the source from which all multiplicity flows. Post-exilic Judaism gave us a God so transcendent he needed intermediaries to engage with matter. Philo drew the line between the transcendent God and the act of creation, and introduced the concept of a logos to bridge the gap. The Gnostics took that line and made it a chasm. They took the intermediary and made it imperfect. They took the problem of evil and solved it, radically, completely, irreversibly, by separating the flawed creator from the perfect source. This is not one tradition borrowing from another in a straight line. It's an idea flowing through different landscapes for 1,500 years, converging in one moment, in one place, into something none of them would have produced alone. Now here's something interesting. The Gnostic vision of a supreme source above the creator, sparks of divine light trapped in matter, a layered cosmic hierarchy. This does not appear only in Christian-adjacent communities reading Plato in Alexandria. It appears independently in traditions with completely different roots. Consider the Mandaeans. The Mandaeans are a religious community whose origins scholars still debate, some placing them in 1st century Jordan or Palestine, others later. What is not debated is that they are still here. Mandaean communities exist today in Iraq, Iran, Australia, and the United States, making them one of the oldest continuously practiced religious traditions on earth. Their sacred text is the Ginza Arba, the Great Treasure, a handwritten sacred scripture passed through an unbroken chain of priests for centuries. To hold a copy is to hold something that connects the present to the ancient world through human hands. Open it, and what you find is a universe built around a supreme being called the Hayyi Rabbi, the Great Life, a transcendent source of light so far beyond the material world that layers of divine beings stand between it and creation. The human soul is a spark of divine light trapped in a material body, yearning to return to the world of light above. The parallels with Gnostic cosmology are almost exact. And yet the Mandeans are not Christian. They revere John the Baptist and reject Jesus. Their tradition draws on Jewish, Babylonian, and Iranian sources, suggesting a development largely independent of the Christian Gnostic schools. The idea of a supreme source above the Creator was not the property of one community. It was in the air. Then there was Plotinus. Born in Egypt around 204 CE, he studied philosophy in Alexandria, served briefly in a military campaign in Persia, and eventually settled in Rome, where he taught, wrote, and built one of the most influential philosophical systems of the ancient world. He is the founder of what we now call Neoplatonism, and the idea at the center of his entire system is this: above everything, above being, above mind, above the gods, above even existence itself, there is a single, absolute source. He called it the One. Not the monad, not God, not the good, though he acknowledged Plato's language. The One. Because even being implies a distinction between what is and what isn't, and the One is prior to that distinction. It is so unified, so complete, so beyond all division, that the only honest thing you can say about it is that it is one. Everything else flows from it, not by decision, but by necessity. The way a sun cannot help but radiate light, the way a perfume cannot help but fill a room. The One overflows into mind, mind overflows into soul, soul overflows into the material world, each level a little further from the source, a little less perfect, a little more divided. Plotinus also called this process emanation. The same way that original document can't help but produce copies once the machine is running, each level of reality is a copy of the one above it. Mind copies the One, soul copies mind, the material world copies soul. By the time you reach us, we are many, many copies down the line, still connected to the original, but very, very far from it. Now, here is what makes this so extraordinary in the context of our story. Plotinus is drawing from the same well as the Gnostics, Plato, and Pythagoras, the same tradition of philosophical transcendence we traced earlier in this video. He knows the Gnostic texts. He has read them. Some of his own students had Gnostic sympathies, but he is furious with them. He writes a treatise against the Gnostics that is one of the most pointed philosophical attacks in ancient literature. His argument: the Gnostics have taken the same map he is using and drawn the wrong conclusion from it. Yes, the material world is imperfect. Yes, it is further from the One than the realm of pure mind, but imperfect does not mean corrupt. Distance from the source does not mean betrayal by the source. The world is still beautiful, still worth being in, still an expression, however faint, of the One's inexhaustible overflow. Plotinus's world is dim, but it is not a prison. Same architecture, same divine source above everything else. Radically different conclusion about the nature of this world. And that difference, between a world that is merely imperfect and a world that is actively fallen, is one of the great fault lines of ancient thought, one that runs, quietly, all the way into the Christianity that would eventually absorb both of them. Plotinus died in 270 CE. His student Porphyry collected and edited his writings into what we now call the Enneads, 6 groups of 9 treatises, one of the most dense and extraordinary philosophical works to survive from the ancient world. They were absorbed into Christian theology, into Islamic philosophy, into Jewish mysticism, and they kept the shape of the One alive for centuries after the communities that first built it had vanished. Finally, there is Mani. Born in 216 CE in Babylon, into a Jewish Christian baptismal community related to the Elcesaites, the very community we examined earlier, Mani receives what he describes as visitations from his divine twin at ages 12 and 24. The twin reveals the true nature of reality and instructs him to teach. What Mani builds is the most ambitious synthetic religion the ancient world produces. Mani presented his teachings as the seal of the prophets, a universal synthesis of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Gnostic Christianity. A radical worldview where God, light, and the devil, darkness, are co-eternal and engaged in a constant struggle. Humanity is seen as a mixture of these two forces. The soul is a divine spark of light trapped within an evil material body. He sends missionaries east into India and China, west through the Roman Empire. He commissions illustrated manuscripts specifically designed to cross language barriers. For decades, Manichaeism was one of the fastest-growing movements in the world. Augustine of Hippo, who will become perhaps the most influential theologian in Christian history, was a Manichaean for 9 years before his conversion. According to later tradition, and we flag this as tradition, not verified history, Mani is executed by the Persian king Bahram I around 274 CE. His followers said his body was displayed above a city gate. Today, Manichaean is often used metaphorically in politics and philosophy to describe a rigid, black and white, or us versus them mentality that ignores nuances and complexities. The movement he started outlasted him by centuries. Manichaean temples survived in China into the 14th century CE. The monad had traveled a very long way from Croton, the home of the Pythagorean school. Now, let's step back and look at the whole map. Imagine you could hover above 1,500 years of history and watch 3 separate rivers flowing through the landscape below. You can see all of them at once. They begin in different places. They flow through different terrain. The people living along each river have no idea the other rivers exist, or that they are all eventually heading toward the same place. The first river begins on the Iranian plateau, around 1200 BCE. A prophet describes the universe as a cosmic battle between a supreme good God and a destructive evil force. It flows westward, shaping Jewish apocalyptic imagination, influencing the way early Christian thinkers described the conflict between light and darkness, eventually feeding into the Manichaean system that spreads across 3 continents. The second river begins in southern Italy, around 530 BCE. A philosopher and his followers propose that ultimate reality is not a powerful being, but a pure mathematical principle. The monad unity. It flows eastward, absorbed into Platonic philosophy, refined by Aristotle's successors, developed by the Middle Platonists into an increasingly elaborate account of what lies above the material world. The third river begins in Babylon, around 586 BCE. In the specific anguish of a people whose God had just let their temple burn. Jewish exiles arrive at an answer that transforms him from a tribal deity into the transcendent sole creator of all things. It flows westward through the prophets, through the wisdom literature, through the apocalyptic texts, carrying an intensifying transcendence that makes God simultaneously more powerful and more distant from the material world he made. For more than 1,000 years, these 3 rivers flow through different landscapes, shaped by different crises, serving different communities. And then, in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, in the intellectual ferment of Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, they converge. Where they meet, the monad, as ultimate source of reality, emerges. So was the monad invented by the Gnostics? Not invented, arrived at. Let's answer precisely. It was not a Bronze Age doctrine. It was not pure Greek mathematics. It was not a spontaneous 3rd century creation. The monad is not any one of these things. It is what happens when all of them arrive at the same place at the same time. The Gnostics did not invent transcendence. Every tradition we have traced was already moving in that direction. Jewish theology was pushing God upward. Greek philosophy was abstracting ultimate reality downward toward a pure principle. Both were widening the gap between the divine and the material world. What the Gnostics invented, or more precisely, what they radicalized, was the moral version of that transcendence. In every tradition before them, the gap between God and the world was a problem to be managed. Angels filled it. The Logos bridged it. Emanations cascaded across it. The distance was real, but the Creator was still, in some sense, connected to the highest source. The Gnostics did something no one before them had dared. They made the gap adversarial. The Creator is not just lower than the monad. He is ignorant of it. He is separated from it. His declaration of supremacy, "I am God, there is no other," is not divine authority. It is a confession of blindness. That move, from managed distance to adversarial separation, is genuinely original. It required the architecture everyone else had been building for 1,500 years, but nobody had used to make this argument. And the argument was powerful enough that the emerging Christian church spent the better part of 2 centuries arguing against it. Which tells you something important. It wasn't easy to dismiss, because the questions underneath it were real. How does a perfect God produce an imperfect world? If God is good and all-powerful, why is there so much suffering? The Gnostics did not ignore those questions. They answered them, completely, radically, without flinching. Source and Creator are not the same. One is ultimate, the other is limited. And then the church said, wrong answer. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, spent 5 books, his Against Heresies, demolishing Gnostic theology. Tertullian wrote against them. Hippolytus of Rome catalogued them. Origen of Alexandria engaged their philosophy at the highest intellectual level. The Church Fathers spent generations arguing against a movement the official church was trying to bury. You don't spend that much effort on something that isn't genuinely threatening, but declaring something as wrong answer doesn't make it go away. The question, how does a perfect God produce an imperfect world, remains as real today as it was in the 2nd century. So, the monad did not fall from the sky. It grew from the ground up, slowly, across 1,500 years, from 3 directions simultaneously, pushed by a pressure that no single tradition generated alone. Zoroastrianism gave the ancient world a supreme good God in cosmic battle. Judaism gave it a transcendent soul creator, pushed so far above the world that angels were needed to bridge the gap. Greek philosophy gave it a first principle, the monad, so pure that even existence itself was a lesser thing that flowed from it. When those 3 currents met in the intellectual world of the early centuries CE, communities began asking the question that all 3 traditions had been building toward without quite arriving at. What if the Creator is not the highest source? That question is the monad's birth certificate. The Gnostics did not invent it. They inherited 15 centuries of theological and philosophical pressure, and then pushed it to its logical limit, without flinching at where the logic led. Which brings us to the question this video has been building toward all along. The monad emerged at the intersection of Jewish theology and Greek philosophy. Christianity absorbed both. So which one left the deeper imprint? The Hebrew covenant tradition or the Greek philosophical framework? That's where we go next, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed this exploration, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Until next time, keep questioning.